So here's a question. Who is it in your life that taught you how to worry? Do you know who it was? Show of hands, how many of you would say it was your mom? It's your mom, Liz. Yeah. What about your dad? A few, okay. How many of you have in your family a kind of informally designated, worrier-in-chief? Oh, come on. Yeah, I knew it. How many of you are the designated worrier-in-chief? And yeah, that's right, Kathy, I see you. For myself, I think I would say that my parents taught me what to worry about. Thankfully, they taught me even more about what not to. But oddly enough, they were not the ones who taught me how to worry. I seem to have picked that up all on my own. You see, my parents were not the ones who taught me about Taco Bell burritos. When it comes to how I, Max Grant, worry, I have learned that Taco Bell is a big part of my initial instinctive response to worry. My second and better response is prayer. Let's start with Taco Bell. I confess that Taco Bell is part of my response, but hear me, church, this is not to say that Taco Bell offers much by way of a solution, and I can tell you that. I have researched this thoroughly. But it is just part of how I initially respond to worry. And that's the thing, right? I mean, that's the thing. Because somehow, how I've learned, how I have taught myself to worry begins with a period where my instinct is not so much to start solving whatever it is that's on my mind. Somehow what I have learned is that where I begin anyway is to dwell in it, to dwell on it. My first instinct is to turn my worrying about something kind of into my own little fiesta for one. And the great challenge for me with worry is not to let myself linger in it. You hear me? You know that? That's where prayer comes in. And actually, I can tell you who it was who taught me that. It was Martin Luther. You see, at some point in my late 20s, I found my way back to church. And that happened not because I had started to feel what I describe now as faith in some fully fledged sort of way, not at least at the start. But what I felt was this deep, deep longing for God. And it wouldn't go away. And I really was not sure what to do with it. The 20s are a brutal time, right? 20s are awful. I had a lot I was trying to figure out and trying to juggle as best I could with the tools I had. And anyway, it's then that I encountered this short anecdote about Martin Luther. Luther was a tremendously busy man in the early days of the Reformation, actively participating in the church and the politics of his day, and those were two profoundly related things at that time. He decided that the Bible needed to be translated into German so that people could actually read it, and so he decided he'd better go ahead and do that, which he did. And so he was doing all of this managing, all of this running around, all of this translating, all of this everything, even as there were periods when he had to go into hiding because there were princes and officials in the church who had put a bounty on his head. So Luther was the leader of a spiritual revolution. But like all revolutions, and as every revolutionary from George Washington to Castro can tell you, there are lots of things to worry about, but only so much that lends itself to one person's control. So think about that for a second. Think about what that must have been like to be Luther. And so apparently, in this period, Luther was asked by a prince or another visitor at a castle where he was staying or whoever. Anyway, Luther was asked what his plans were for the following day. And this is what he said. He responded, work. Work from early until late. Work. In fact, I have so much to do that I'll have to spend the first 3 hours of the day in prayer. And to me at that time, that was a new thought. It was a new thought because what it seemed to point to was that for Luther, prayer was not just a formula that you said or a momentary break to hear a word from our sponsor. Prayer was looser than that, but far more vital. Prayer was about staying grounded in our relationship with the eternal, about listening deeply to what the eternal had to say to us here in the realm of the temporary and imperfect. Without that grounding, and without the prayer that grounded him, Luther recognized that nothing worth doing would ever get done. And that was incredibly important to me. It was incredibly important because it taught me that without a doubt there are some things that still do matter when seen in the light of eternity. There are things that rise to that level. And yet there is so much that does not. Not so long ago, I told the story of my teacher who sent me a postcard reminding me of how inconsolable I'd been about a bad grade the year before. Do you guys remember that story? I talked about what an eye-opener it was, that kind of moment of perspective. Well, I'm afraid that's a lesson that I've had to learn more than once in life. And Luther's teaching about prayer is that similarly perspectival kind of insight. But you know, Linda Hardig actually put it so well for me this last week at Bible study when she observed that some worry is important for us to do. Some worry is important for us not to. Worry that gets us moving, that expresses care in a way that we can actually do something about, well, that's one thing. But worry for its own sake is something different. And not necessarily helpful. In fact, almost certainly not. And that's right. I mean, you can learn a lot from Linda. There is worry that God places on our hearts, a sense of concern and relationship that we are called to do something about. And then, well, there is that Taco Bell kind of worry. The aimlessly wheel-spinning kind of worry. And it's there, when I go there, when I start there, that I don't worry, I think, about the things I can actually control. That's where I let myself become mired in the things that I cannot control. And I must say, Luther taught me better than that. And so, of course, does Jesus. Matthew's gospel put it this way: can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. And he continues, therefore do not worry, saying, what will we eat? Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear? But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew's word for worry is actually quite helpful on this point, because the word he uses is the Greek word merimnao, which, there's a quiz later, so be sure to get that down. Merimnao. And that itself is a blend of two other words, marizo for divide, and then nous, which is the word for mind. So to be worried then, as Jesus tells it, as Matthew records it, is to be one with a divided mind. And I know just how that feels, don't you? It's the word Jesus uses, merimnao, when he speaks to Martha. In the Martha and Mary story, when he says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled, divided mind, about many things. One thing is needful, one thing. Mary has chosen the good portion which shall not be taken away from her. It's the word Paul uses to the church at Philippi when he counsels them, have no anxiety, divided mind, about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Do not let your mind become divided. And so much of worry does that. It divides our minds. And if we're not careful, worry can divide our heart, maybe even our loyalties. Because worry challenges us to remain grounded in what is most important, what it is that rises to the level of the eternal. That's the challenge Jesus gives to his disciples, and that's the challenge that he gives us, his disciples, today. It's a challenge of our loyalties. It's also a challenge of practices and of our willingness to ground ourselves sufficiently so that our spiritual roots can begin to grow. Transformation is slow work. Worry always seems to catch us by surprise. So what are we doing to keep our eyes on what truly rises to the level of the eternal in our lives? That's the question. And Jesus pushes us to ask also if we really find him in the ways we seek to manage those moments when they come. Is Jesus at Taco Bell? I haven't seen him there yet. Not yet. For the last couple of weeks, we have considered some of the ways that doubt and faith are related, and I've tried to make the case that doubt is very much part of the life of faith. That, for example, perhaps Thomas was not so much doubtful as he was a person who could only know things in his own particular way, as indeed we all must do. And last week I suggested that as our faith evolves, we outgrow some of the answers that had been so important and so nurturing for us before, but which now no longer quite fit us, and that the time kind of betwixt and between can be difficult, but that new answers come. By way of conclusion, I would just say that of all the things we go through in the living of our days, Worry can push so many questions on us. Worry casts doubt on so many things, not only the bad ones, but sometimes the good ones too. Sometimes only for a season or sometimes for longer. To worry is to live with a mind divided. It's to be so distracted that we can begin to lose sight of where our love and loyalties truly lie. And our great task with God's help is to keep those things in view. We have to push past our initial response and seek the source of what truly sustains us. That source without which nothing worth doing would ever get done, as Luther saw. It is to look to Jesus, in whom, as Paul said, all things hold together. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven. And the rest, my friends, is Taco Bell.